Hey, media accountability. That's the theme I want to be covering in this video. I will probably be touching on some things I've already spoken about in previous videos, but to be quite honest, I think this is one of the most important issues of our time. So I don't think that matters because this is something that needs to be emphasized over and over again. Um, I find myself in a very, something of a wilderness in terms of how I perceive this. Um, I know there's people out there who absolutely don't believe the media at all, who take the position that all mainstream media, which I believe is a contentious term, and I'll explain that in a minute, it's all corrupt as hell, and therefore you can't believe any of it. I'm not quite that cynical, but I can see where it comes from. I can definitely see where that comes from. I've just been watching CNN, and they're once again attacking President Trump. It's clearly obvious that CNN has long had a liberal bias, liberal left wing bias. And there's been a few situations now where they have been purportedly exposed for basically corruption, I would argue, in terms of setting situations up. And there were two cases I could think of. One was during one of the presidential debates. I can't remember if it was the second or third debate, but basically there was a CNN person, can't remember who it was, but she was heard on camera basically whispering to get Democratic watchers in terms of these feedbacks they have after the debate, basically whispering to them seemingly what to say. This is on YouTube. Another situation was after the one of the London attacks. I think it was the Westminster Bridge incident. Actually, it may have been the London Bridge incident, and it looked like Muslim protesters were making a demonstration against the terrorist attack, like not in the name of Islam. And again, it looked like CNN was choreographing this protest rather than filming it as an event. It looked like they were actually staging the event themselves. At least that's what it looked like on the surface. It may have been that they were just trying to set up the camera equipment, but certainly it looked dubious. And there's been a few situations like this. So I believe there is abundant evidence to show that CNN has a very deeply entrenched liberal bias. Um, Now, it's not that Fox News is any better. Fox News has long had a conservative bias, and I don't think anyone can rationally claim otherwise. When you look at some of the shock jocks that have been on Fox News over the years, the recently disgraced Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity, and others, clearly there is a very right wing bias on Fox News. Again, I don't think anyone could rationally claim that there isn't. So, what you have here is two very partisan camps, two very powerful organizations that, in my opinion, are as bad as each other in their own way. I used to prefer CNN because I believe it had a more internationalist outlook. And I used to, perhaps I'd not quite seen that liberal bias really in its full extent until this recent American election. I always suspected that there was a bit of a liberal bias there, but I guess I only really noticed it to its full extent in this recent American election. And I suppose, to be completely candid, at the times when Fox News pissed me off, um, I went to CNN. Now I find myself when CNN pisses me off, I wouldn't say I endorse Fox News, but basically they're as bad as each other. I know Fox likes to say it's not mainstream. I would like someone to define what mainstream is exactly. It's I find people who endorse Russia Today and who watch Russia Today are constantly attacking the mainstream media. The point I've made is that Russia Today is mainstream Russian media. It is the Russian state broadcaster. It's basically a mouthpiece of the Kremlin. So I don't like to use the term mainstream media because I think it's a bit of a vague term. I don't think anyone can really clearly define what it is. Um, The problem is it's very difficult to know what to believe because, as I've just spoken about, there is clear bias in big organizations, big networks. But the problem is when you get into, let's say, underground networks or, you know, sites that are a lot smaller in scale, in terms of their workforce and in terms perhaps of their reach, and which tend to operate on YouTube and tend to operate more as internet news. Certainly, they're very biased. I mean, Rebel Media, for example, clearly has a right wing bias. That's not to say they're right or wrong, but they are populist right. You know, there's no question about that. Infowars, again, populist right. Um, they're not mainstream right. They're not mainstream Republican, but they are. They definitely have a conservative angle to them. You know, they're pro guns, they're pro, they're anti gay rights, etc., etc. They have a very conservative pitch, and I don't think anyone could deny that. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that is the case. So what I'm driving at is it is very difficult to find any media source, mainstream or otherwise, which doesn't have some bias. So the question then becomes, well, if we hold a free media up to be important for holding politicians, for example, to account, then who holds the media to account? And it isn't just America. I've been talking a lot about American networks here. We get it in the UK as well. The BBC is often accused of having a left wing bias. Sky News often is accused of having a right wing bias. The Murdoch press, the Murdoch tabloids are extremely right wing. But then again, the Guardian newspaper and I and the Independent are left wing. So as someone who identifies with the political centre, I struggle to find any media network or newspaper that really is loyal or consistent to the centre. The eye is roughly centre left, but it's definitely more to the left. The Times is broadly centre right, but it is a struggle to find any publication or network that really, really is neutral. And perhaps that's too much to ask for because journalists are human beings, and with the greatest will in the world, they're going to have opinions. What I have a problem with is that too often the opinion pieces and too often the commentators seem to override good old fashioned journalism, which should be just about reporting the news. So, what Fox News argues when they're accused of bias is they say, but the people that you're talking about being biased, for example, Sean Hannity and so on, they are not the main anchor people, they're just um, commentators. The problem is, commentators, from my perspective, seem to take up a big bulk of the airtime. And it's the same with CNN. And the problem is, there's an incredible arrogance. I mean, with CNN, instead of actually addressing some of the charges against them, they've spent the entire time basically feeling sorry for themselves. Like, how dare President Trump attack us? Here's the thing, I know there are many good journalists out there, and I'm a strong believer in freedom of the press. I mean, we have to bear in mind that there are parts of the world where journalists really are risking their lives to report the news. And in many cases, they have paid with their lives. There's parts of the world like Iraq, parts of Latin America, Central America, indeed East Asia, where journalists face death or harassment on a regular basis. I mean, Reporters Without Borders does fantastic work in this regard, so I will always, always defend the right of journalists to do their job. Jeremy Corbyn recently said, despite the enormous heat he has taken from the media, he pointed that out that we have to defend the free press. So I give him credit for that. But I would also say that when journalists turn around and complain about this and say, oh, don't attack us because you have to have a free media, what I would say is, okay, journalists should have a right to do their job, but they cannot believe that they themselves are above criticism. And for me, that is a big issue, a very big issue, is this incredible arrogance that they think that they're above criticism themselves. Um, you know, journalism is not an easy job being a journalist is not easy. They have to do abundant research. They have to report with the information they have. I've found myself defending journalists. For example, there was criticism over the Grenfell Tower disaster. I pointed out that the journalists there can only work with the information they have, and that's true. And in countries like China, people criticize biased Western media. Well, the point I would make is, you know, when you have an authoritarian government that limits what can be reported, you can't exactly turn around and point to bias when journalists have their hands tied in terms of what they can report. So I try to be fair with this. Where I believe the media is being treated unfairly, where they're being attacked simply for doing their job, I will defend them. But I also believe that there is an arrogance in terms of, I mean, we've seen what's happening here with President Trump. I cannot think of any other president except Richard Nixon who has had such a tumultuous relationship with the media as President Trump is having. And this is a really difficult thing because part of it, Donald Trump has tapped into something. And that is there is widespread mistrust of the media. So when he talks about fake news, I think there is something to that. On the other hand, what seems to be happening is every time Donald Trump has a negative coverage, he turns around and says it's fake news. So the side effect of this is you have the media institution not being trusted by anyone, and that is as problematic as if the political institution wasn't trusted by anyone. So I suppose I'm somewhere in the middle. I believe that there is definitely corruption out there in terms of the deeply entrenched bias. But I don't agree with those who say that, oh, it's all bullshit, it's all lies, because I think that's tapping into something that is not particularly helpful to anyone. And I don't believe that it is all lies. I believe more often than not, journalists are working with the information they have. The problem is when they do show bias and then they're too arrogant to admit it, and they're too arrogant to actually reflect on themselves and say, okay, we might be wrong about this. That's where people get angry, and that's where people say, well, you're full of shit. So when CNN says, oh, President Trump's picking on us, and they sit around with the little commentary box, I forget what they call it, and their entire pitches, why is he picking on us? These are people who are on very strong salaries. They have a lot of responsibility. And it's about time they stop feeling sorry for themselves and they start to actually consider, well, is there something to this? Maybe there is a perception that we are biased. Maybe, just maybe, we have to address this and we have to stop being so biased. The same with Fox News. So the question then comes, who holds the media to account? Now, in the UK, we have an organisation called Ofcom. And Ofcom's responsibility ostensibly is to hold the media to account. So, for example, when they slander someone, when they get something wrong, they're supposed to be held to account and to apologise for it. I think we've a long way to go. When the tabloid, for example, gets something wrong on page one, they might apologise, but they'll apologise in small letters on page 30. That's not good enough. I believe that the response has to be proportionate to the mistake. So if they make a mistake in their headline, they have to, in another headline, say, we were wrong. That would be fair. They have shown they're not prepared to do this. When a politician says something controversial, when when they've done something that disgraces their office, they're expected to make a public apology. If not, they're forced to resign. So why should it be any different for top media executives? I do believe that, I also see figures like Jeremy Paxman and Piers Morgan. They get a great deal of smugness by putting politicians on the spot. But who puts them on the spot? Who holds them to account? That's what I find, frankly, hard to stomach. I will always defend the right of journalists to do their job, to hold politicians to account. But I will also defend politicians in terms of defending themselves. And if that means robustly arguing back, so be it. The likes of Piers Morgan and Jeremy Paxman have to stop thinking they represent the wider public. They don't. They represent themselves and they represent whichever organization they come from. That's not to say they're always wrong. It's not to say they don't raise important questions, but there's something particularly obnoxious about the way they do it. And it seems to be much more about their ego than about just finding the truth. It seems to be about putting politicians in the hot seat just because they can. It's not a level playing field. So, quite honestly, I do find myself getting very worked up by when I see media people show such bias and then take no responsibility for it, or if they were at least honest about it. It's the fact that they will openly say, we are fair and balanced. No, you're not. You're a liberal organization. Just admit that you're a liberal organization, then you would have more credit, because at least you would be honest about it. I mean, Fox News claims that they are fair and balanced. No, they're not. They're extremely biased to conservative views. They'll occasionally have a token liberal. But don't say that you're fair and balanced when you're clearly not. And the thing about bias is not the same as fake news. It's not the same as telling falsehoods. It's just that it is what it is. It's bias. So I'll leave it there. Let me know your thoughts. What I would suggest, though, is that people. The problem is, I can't say think for yourselves because you cannot know the whole story. If there's something going on, whether it be in Syria or whether it be in the United States or Britain or wherever, we cannot know the whole story. And by the way, simply visiting a country doesn't mean you know everything. So when I hear people say things like, oh, I was in Castro's Cuba and it's not as bad as people say, that doesn't mean anything. Do you really think a dictatorship's going to let you know the whole picture? Ultimately, what it comes down to is this. None of us, none of us can know everything. We just can't. So no one should be so smug to think that they know everything. But the point is, media organizations have enormous power, especially in Western democracies, and they need to be held to account as well. I don't know if the United States has some sort of media watchdog. We do in the UK, but even in the UK, I don't believe it's good enough. I don't believe it goes far enough. I believe the media still gets away with far too much bias. But there you have it. Let me know your thoughts, and thanks for watching.